My name is Brent Holner. I'm the regional director for the South Central region for Best Friends Animal Society. I've been with Best Friends for about 14 months or so now. Before that, I was with an organization and co-founded an organization called Kansas City Pet Project in Kansas City, Missouri. We'll talk a little bit about that here shortly. And then I'm going to let Ellen introduce herself, although that's probably a little unnecessary in this stage before we get started.
Awesome. Thanks, Brent. Can you guys hear me okay? If I'm close? Okay, great. So we felt like the data is so critical to what we're trying to accomplish to save all the animals that we wanted to spend a foundational hour trying to get information into your head so that over the next 3 days you can pick the classes that will pick apart the groups of animals that you're trying to save. So as data can be super boring, we're going to try to make this interesting, but I think hopefully it'll leave you with some really tangible things to be able to do. So we talked about in the last session about minding the gap, and it's really critical. We are, as animal welfare, I was just talking to somebody that the data is still kept in a shoebox on index cards for the shelter. You know, we are really behind the times as far as our industry is concerned. And so we have a lot of catching up to do, and we need to figure out who's not making it across that yellow bridge and be able to save them. So gap analysis is used to, it's to be able to see where you want to be. So you know where you are, and you're trying to project where you want to be and what steps you have to take to get there. So, and the resources that you need. I think that that's something that we often don't talk about, is the resources that are necessary to get each group of animals saved. So we're hoping to dive into that a little bit today, and again, hopefully give you a blueprint moving forward. So one of the most important things that helped us here in Austin is really diving down to one topic. So animal welfare has, especially municipal shelters, have a lot of competing interests. Actually, nonprofits do too. And you're being pulled in a million different directions. People want public spay-neuter, people want TNR, people want all the free-roaming dogs and cats picked up, nuisance calls. There's a million things that can get your attention, but if you really want to increase your live release rate, you have to actually focus on that one thing, even if it's just temporarily until you get it raised up, and then you're able to expand your focus a little bit further. But if you don't dive deep on that one topic, then you can't make any progress if you're spread too thin. So what we really focused on is no unnecessary death in the shelter, and every action that we took was making a live outcome from a possible dead one, and that's it. If it didn't have that effect, then we didn't do it. So I know that not everybody here is from a municipal shelter, obviously, and so we wanted to explain why we think this is important to everybody. Obviously, at the municipal level, it is breaking through all that fog of all the different competing things, everybody telling you should do this, you should do this, you should do this, and really trying to have a laser-like focus on live outcomes. For the nonprofit, I think as nonprofits, we also get scattered, and we tend to do our own thing when animals are dying in our community. And we have an opportunity to support the municipal shelter and solve for the animals dying with them and be the partner that they need us to be. Austin was kind of, we had a lot of conflict with that at the beginning, but I don't think that shouldn't occur in every community. Our hope is that if everybody knows what piece they play and how they work together, then it can be a really collaborative and just skyrocket towards success, instead of working against each other. And then for the advocates, if people know what the shelter needs, if you have a better understanding of what has to happen in your community, then you can advocate to city council, to the commissioners, to the people that make the decisions to get those resources there so that the animals can be saved. If the shelter, the municipal shelter, is struggling by themselves to accomplish this, they're never going to get there. But if everybody has the same message and is beating the same drum, then we're more likely to get to no-kill cities across the country. So I think, Brent, this is where you come in.
So really, when it comes to gathering the data for your community, there are really kind of 4 options for gathering that data. So option 1 is to guess. Don't do that. If you can avoid that, don't do that, because Everybody says trust your gut, and we find that a lot of people make a lot of mistakes when they're trusting their gut when it comes to data. So avoid trusting your gut on this because it causes a lot of problems. Use data, some data, and I'll give you some examples of what you can use. So don't do that. Great data. So great data will be very detailed, and it will break down the euthanasia numbers by exactly what animals are dying, when they're dying, what time of year that they're dying, and what we can do to help create that. So, yeah, there we go. So it will break it down by age, species, size. So you might have adult dogs versus puppies. It will break it down by specific problems that are there. So it might break down specific diseases that animals are dying from. The more detailed the data, the more accurately you're going to be able to design programs to address the specific problems that are happening in your community. So try to work to get great data. The reality is most organizations, even really well-run organizations, still don't have great data. That they may have big groups of animals that are in severe medical, and we don't really know what severe medical means without diving into it. So you may have to make some concessions on some of it, but continue to work toward having better data, because the better data you have, the better programming you're going to be able to have to solve it. And I also want to say, don't let this slow you down. If you don't have great data, don't allow the absence of great data to keep you from starting to save lives in your community, because you can start to save lives even without fantastic data. Because option 3 can be using smaller pieces of data to build your story. So maybe you take a month during the summer and a month during the winter, or even a week during the summer and a week during the winter, and go through the data from PetPoint or Chameleon and just start going through line by line and making a list of every animal that died and why it died. Or maybe you're going through a shoebox full of paperwork and saying, why did this animal die? Let's make a checklist so that we can start making a checklist of what animals are dying in your community and which ones aren't. You can do it with a smaller data set. It would be better to have the full one, but in absence of going through 10,000 records over the course of a year to try to get that data, condensing it into a smaller chunk will help you be able to identify that still. And this might be a sample data sheet. So this is one that they used in El Paso and basically went through the records and went through line by line and said, okay, big dogs used over 4 months. Were they healthy? Did they have behavioral challenges? Did they just have kennel cough? You know, how you deal with those different things there are different solutions to those challenges. They also had a big category under medical, and it was just medical euthanasia. But then you start looking at it, and it's like parvo, distemper, okay, probably. But then you get into some of the things, and it's like, well, there's some pretty treatable diseases on there that were treated as severe medical. And so knowing that some of those are not as severe, because when we think of severe medical, we think hit by a car, like immediate euthanasia is required. That may not be the case in all of these cases. So being able to write it down and being able to really articulate what the need is in your community is going to be really important. If you don't have any data, use other people's data. So we do this in a lot of communities, and we visit a lot of shelters, and we look at a lot of data, and it is amazing how similar the data is from community to community and across different areas. So you saw this chart earlier on. When you get into the in the low live release rates, so if you're in the 20-25% live release rates, there are a lot of healthy, adoptable pets that are dying in your community. And so knowing that there are highly adoptable, high demand pets that are dying in your community knows that there are outlets for that you can either transport those to other communities. You can do adoption programs to help get some of those animals out. But we know that those are very healthy, very high demand animals. When you get into the mid-50s, so in that green area there's some minor issues now that are starting to pop up. You might have some kennel cough, some minor URI, some mange, very treatable, non-problematic things, but they're going to take just a little bit more work than the highly adoptables that were further down the scale. As you get toward the red areas, you're going to end up with large breed dogs that are getting euthanized for space because they're hanging out there too long. Or you might end up with some severe medical issues that really need to be addressed. So this is when you get into some of your bottle babies, some of your ringworms, some of your kind of broken dogs and cats that need a lot of help. This is where you get into Parvo. And I'll note, depending on the community, these last two will flip on occasion. Some communities do better with medical and then need more help on the behavior, and some communities flip-flop it. So that one will depend a little bit on your community, but the more you're able to know, the the more you're able to design a program for saving those animals' lives. And it's also important, like, you don't necessarily start on the far end of the spectrum, and you don't start saving lives in your community with Parvo. But eventually, if you're going to pass the 90% threshold and continue to move on, somebody in your community is going to have to save those last 2 groups of dogs and cats. So I think that's really important to know that someone somewhere along the line is going to have to help with those animals. So I'm going to talk a couple case studies because I want you to understand how this plays out in a real life scenario, and how understanding what animals are in need helps you design programs that specifically target those animals that are in need. So I'm going to start with Kansas City because I started up there in 2012, and we took over the shelter in 2012 in January 1st of that year. We were coming off of a year in which we had a 62% save rate. So there were still quite a few animals that needed to be saved and a lot of help that needed to be done. The 3 categories that we identified were feral cats, because at that time Kansas City has an abandonment law, and so it was illegal for the shelter to release feral cats out into the community. And so every feral cat that came in was getting killed. We also knew there were a high volume of adoptable cats that were getting killed, and there were a high volume of adoptable dogs. So that helped us create programming around those individual groups. So the first thing we did was we started a barn cat program. We couldn't release feral cats, but we could sure adopt them out to people who had barns, and we're in Kansas City. There are a lot of barns pretty close to Kansas City. So we designed a barn cat program, and this helped save a significant chunk of animals that otherwise had no possible good outcome. And Rachel Long, if she's in here, raise your hand, Rachel. She designed this program for us up there, so she's amazing. And doing amazing work up in Iowa now. So the barn cat program was the first thing, like I think this is the first flyer we ever did as an organization, was creating a barn cat program. The second thing we did was increased adoptions. And so we started with taking great adoption photos. My background's in marketing, so this is one of the few things I knew how to do. And so we just started like increasing the demand for our pets via social media and increasing our marketing. We reached out to a professional photographers group in Kansas City and said, hey, we could use your help. And had people just volunteering to come out and take professional photos. And we were the first organization in Kansas City in that metropolitan area to use professional photography, and it really helped build our brand and build the image of our pets. We also did a ton of adoption events. We were probably doing adoption events once a month, sometimes twice a month, depending on how full our shelter was, just giving anybody a reason to come out this weekend to adopt pets from us, because if we didn't get them out of our shelter this weekend, euthanasia was a likely option for them. And so we did everything we could to continue to drive traffic out to the shelter to increase adoptions. At the very end of the year, we also opened up a satellite adoption center. So the one on the left is a satellite adoption center that we opened up in a place called Zona Rosa. It's an outdoor shopping center in Kansas City. It's about 20 minutes from our main shelter environment. And it, again, gave us a more of a retail setting and another location, another touch point to adopt animals out of our shelter. And again, it was all about creating more opportunities for animals to be adopted from us. That facility now is doing more than 1,500 adoptions a year that we think are all incremental, that would never have happened if they were required to come to our main shelter facility. We liked it so much that in 2013 we also opened up a second one inside a Petco location. So it's a store within a store at a Petco location. That one location does about 900 adoptions a year, incremental. So at the end of 2012, because we'd increased our adoptions, we'd increased our barn cat program, we were up to an 86% save rate. Adoptions had doubled over the course of that year over what they were the year before we took over. But there's still work to do. So we had to keep all those programs because that work was still ongoing, but those programs were built, so we had to continue on. But what else did we need to add? So we then looked at our data. The data was better now because we were in control of the data and we were making progress. And so we looked at it, it's like pets that were still at risk. We had neonatal kittens. We had Parvo dogs. We had a lot of high energy dogs that were not aggressive, but they were coming into our shelter environment, and our shelter in Kansas City is old and dilapidated, and we were causing them to have behavior problems. And we were like, okay, so how do we solve for these things? So we started up a bottle feeding program. And I know that a lot of folks will come out to APA's shelter and see their neonatal kitten ward, and it's fantastic, and I recommend it. we didn't have, because of the location of our shelter and the design of our shelter, we really didn't have a space for that, and it wasn't convenient or safe for people to go to late at night. So we do all of ours through foster. And so we created a foster network of just people who do neonatal kittens. And I can tell you that right now they're all kind of jonesing for some neonatal kittens to be bottle fed and stay up all night with. And so we started doing that, and it allowed us to save that pretty significant chunk of animals that were currently dying in our shelter. We also set up a Parvo ward that saves about 120 dogs a year that otherwise were being euthanized because we didn't have a Parvo ward. And I hear a lot of people say, well, I don't have space for a Parvo ward in my shelter. We didn't either. But these two puppies that came in early 2013, our director of operations looked at the two of them, they tested positive for Parvo, and she's like, you know what, not today, we're not going to kill you today. And so she cleaned out her office, which was in an old locker room that was used when it was still an animal control facility. So she threw all of her stuff out of the old locker room, out into the hallway, moved a bank of kennels into the locker room, and that's been our Parvo ward. And we've been saving 120 plus dogs a year out of that old locker room facility since that day. We also then brought Amy Sadler, who's here and will be presenting sometime this weekend, to do playgroups, because we knew that we had identified that group of dogs that were getting restless at the shelter and were melting down mentally in our shelter facility. So this gave them the socialization and the ability to burn off the steam that would cause them to not break down mentally. And so that saved probably about 5% of our population with just that group of dogs through our playgroup program. And so it's really an important part of what we did. At the end of 2013, we finished that year with a 92% live release rate. We had now tripled the number of adoptions that we were doing, so we were up 200% in the number of adoptions. And we were looking at things and we're like, you know what, there's still a little bit of work to do. There are still some animals that we feel like if we had a few more resources and a few more things available to us that we might be able to save. So one of those areas was extreme medical. And so we were running about 10,000 animals a year through a 400 square foot veterinary clinic, which kind of gave us some limitations on what we could save in that veterinary clinic. Think about a vet clinic about the size of your hotel room if you're staying at this hotel and running 10,000 animals a year through it. That's what we were doing. And so we set up basically in that parking lot, we set up a veterinary trailer and set up a double wide trailer, and that's now our vet clinic. And gives us a little more space for isolation, gives us a little more space so that dogs with severe medical needs that need more observation, they can now be observed by our vet staff and don't have to hang out in a hallway, which was our solution for it before. And so that's really helped save a lot of animals' lives. And then this summer, we opened up a new thing called the SHU, the Special Handling Unit. So there was still a group of dogs that were coming in that were showing us behavior things that we didn't feel necessarily terribly comfortable sending animals out based on the behavior we were seeing, but we still felt that that behavior was induced by our shelter environment. And we were like, the best thing that can happen is for these dogs to get out of the shelter, and yet we don't feel safe doing so based on the behavior they're showing. So we bought an old dentist's office, retrofitted it into a much smaller scale facility, let our training staff that is now working with them. About half the dogs that we move over within 2 days are showing signs of being normal dogs and are fine. And so we're just adopting them out of that facility. The other half now still need a little incremental work, and so it gives us a little bit more time and a little more space to work with those guys. So that's the end of 2013 when we identified the extreme medical and the behavior piece of it. So that kind of tells you, like, as we were able to identify groups of animals that needed help, it allowed us the opportunity to build programs specifically to help those animals so that we weren't wasting resources helping animals that didn't need help or that were already safe in our community. It allowed us to target our efforts very solely on the animals that were needing help. I want to use another case study, and this will be a little bit shorter, but it gives you the example of why using data is really important. So I was working with a county shelter that was committed to going no-kill. So they had county commitment across the board. So from the government on down through all levels of management, they were committed to going no-kill. And I met with the shelter director. They were at about 75%. And I met with the shelter director there, and they were doing a lot of work and working really hard. They were doing adoption promotions pretty regularly to bring people out to the shelter. They had hired a vet, so they were doing a lot more medical than they had ever done before. They had also implemented a behavior program. But when I sat down and talked to the shelter director, he's like, listen, I feel like we're working really hard and we're not moving the needle very much. And I feel like for as much work as we're putting in, we should be moving it a little bit more. So when we dived into the data, we found out that 60% of the animals that were dying were feral cats. And they also have an abandonment law in their county. So they weren't legally allowed to release the cats. So they were just euthanizing them. And as a matter of like, this is what legally we're required to do. And they knew this, but I don't think they understood the volume of animals that it was making up on their euthanasia list. So they were working really hard on that last group that takes a lot more money and resources. And they had this big group of animals that it's like, if we could just get TNR legalized in your community, then you're set, you're on your way. And what ended up happening is they're using that data now to go to the county commission and say, we need TNR legalized in this county. We all said we want to get to 90%. We can't get there mathematically unless we allow for TNR, and it's now going to create change in their community for it. So I'm really excited for them, but it was diving into the data to provide the data point. One, to identify exactly what the problem was and why they couldn't make more progress with all the work they were putting in. But number two, having the data to make the point for their county commission in order for them to make the change that's necessary.
So we wanted to try to condense everything that has happened here in Austin and kind of give you a blueprint, like I said earlier. One thing I wanted to clarify that I also said earlier is that we didn't take our eye off of the other commitments that the city needed to accomplish for the community. It's just that there was a prioritization. And so no-kill was a priority for the city council, and it took a few years to get it nailed down. And then the animal protection programs that were created by the city of Austin came after that, and that helped solidify everything that we were doing. So it's not that you only do this and you don't do anything else, it's that you focus for a short period of time to get it done, and then you start expanding your focus. Anyway, I think this helps to kind of keep it all in perspective. So I'm going to go over the 12-point programmatic recipe that we used here in Austin. And then also, if you keep that in your mind as you want, we're going to work backward from the results that you want. The results that are happening in no-kill cities, work backwards from that. So that gives you a goal instead of just increasing adoptions or increasing transfers. If you have a numeric goal to go towards, then you can start measuring your success towards it. And then setting programmatic KPI, this is incredibly important. If you have an adoption program and you're paying people to do adoptions and they're doing one adoption a day, then there's a problem. And having some sort of measurements around leading to the goal that you want, to the numeric goal that you want, is going to help you keep your entire staff focused and delegate everything out. Your staff, your volunteer groups, everybody. If you're doing a lot of activities that aren't netting what you want to actually have happen, then it's just a waste of time. So it's really important to have at least one key performance indicator for everything that you're doing. And then building capacity. That I mentioned that earlier. In the no-kill movement, we have a tendency to talk about doing all these programs and save all the lives and not talk about what it actually requires to do that, because there is some investment. And you can be creative about that investment and get it. There's a lot of fundraising classes that we're offering this weekend. You can be creative and get a lot of in-kind. You can do stuff like clean out an office and put some puppies in there. But you have to find those resources. You have to find that office or fund that building, or however you need to get there. And let's see. So working backwards from a goal. So we've found that looking at cities that are achieving 90% plus, there's a small percentage of return to owner. So about 20% are going back to their owners. And there is a huge number that are transfers and adoptions. And in the smaller cities, small and medium cities, it seems like most of the adoptions are happening in-house. We have a great example of Williamson County just to the north of us, and they do something like 70% of their animals go out through adoptions from their facility. It's interesting because that number is almost the same number of adoptions as the city of Austin does at their facility. So I think when you get bigger, you need to have more outcomes for those animals than just adoption because of the huge volume. And so for the big cities that are at 90%, we're seeing 30% transfers and 45% adoptions. And so even though that's not your data, you don't know what your data is going to be in the long run. This gives you a goal to work backwards from and start shooting for a goal of 30% transfer and 45% adoptions if you're a large facility. And then you can measure your progress every month towards that and get your team excited about reaching those goals. The 12 points, and I'll give you a little bit more detail, but they're kind of high-level points, and this whole conference is digging deep into them. So for something like the S&R program, obviously we're not going to go into detail in this presentation about that, but there is a presentation about it. So if your community needs that, go to that class and learn about it. So with the programmatic recipes and trying to develop KPIs, there's a workplace culture agreement that the City of Austin uses, and I think Kristen brought it to Pima County as well, that I starred the things that we don't actually have a class about, but we can get you that information if you are looking for it. That's important because your whole team needs to be focused on saving lives. And if you have people that don't believe, that fundamentally are not on the same page, that can bring down what you're trying to do and cause you to go backwards or not gain any momentum. So it's important to have everybody's buy-in and spend time trying to educate your whole team so that everybody's excited about the goal. Foster program. We were playing around with percentages, and roughly 7% of your annual dog intake and 15% of your annual cat intake in foster at a time. So that gives you a numeric goal to have in foster at any time. That's a huge foster program. So if you're a big shelter, you're going to have to build big foster resources. It doesn't mean you have to spend a lot of money. Foster is actually one of the least expensive programs that you can do, but it saves a ton of lives because you're essentially, in some cases, in our case, in Austin, at Austin Pets Alive, we're doubling our cage capacity by putting those animals in homes and not using a cage at our facility. Progressive adoption policies. This is all open adoption policies. We have classes on adoptions. It is the best practice now. So there's still holdouts of doing vet checks and home checks and all of that. That's not the way the world is moving. The world is moving towards open adoption policies. So definitely get educated on that if you're not already. They're important to keep the animals moving. It's just like in the olden days when animals are euthanized for cage space, you have to get animals out as fast as euthanasia to get that cage space open so new animals can come in. Otherwise, if you have a holdup like adoption holds, like if you hold for adopters they're out of town for the weekend and they want to pick up on Monday, that's a cage that you're wasting that could have been used on a live outcome, another animal having a couple extra days. So it's important to really understand this. And then S&R can be a huge percentage. We were just in El Paso, and 4,200 cats are leaving their facility through the S&R program. That's amazing. That's a huge chunk. That's a big percentage chunk of their what they're trying to achieve with live release. The points 5 through 8, intake prevention, that's or diversion, however you want to talk about it. It's the helping people solve their own problems. We tend to just be the receptacle, kind of the garbage receptacle for people's problems instead of proactively helping them solve those problems. A lot of people want to keep their pet, they just don't know how to do it. I had a situation this last weekend where one of my fosters was returned because the woman was very depressed and was in and out of the hospital, and her other dog tore his ACL ligament, and it was going to cost $2,500, and she couldn't afford it because she had all these medical bills. So she returned both dogs to APA, and just by talking to her, we were like, you don't have to fix the knee right now. That's not life or death, but these animals love you, and if you're depressed, the best thing you can have is the pets in your life. And she was just like so happy. She took them home. She was thrilled. She was crying, and so people think they need to get rid of their pets when oftentimes they don't need to get rid of their pets. And it's that conversation about a different solution that has to happen. Somebody has to do it. It takes more time, so you need more people that can focus on it, but it's important. Progressive return to owner policies. These will be covered in detail with the animal protection classes. Really important stuff happening. One of the things that April Moore, who will be speaking, talks about is how the city animal control officers used to be judged on the number of animals that they picked up. That was their performance metric. And so by simply shifting that to the number you don't pick up and the number that you help people keep, that changed their entire attitude. They used to lure animals off properties to get their numbers. And so having a different mindset, a different KPI is what helped change the culture. Really important. Transferring or transporting, there's some communities that their intake far exceeds their human population, and so proportionally. So transport is a really good option, and I would lump transport and transfer in the same. If you're transferring to an organization, whether they're in New York or in the same city, it's still a transfer. And so keep that same KPI for that. And then you can't do anything for the animals if you have a lot of disease. And so the disease prevention is very, very important. There are some KPIs associated with it. Calculating the number of animals that died in care is an easy way to kind of see how healthy the population is on site. And then post-adoption complaints too. Okay, so trying to go through this quickly. The timely medical make-ready. One of the big bottlenecks we saw at the City of Austin before we started Austin Pets Alive was that the animals would sit in the cage for 1 to 2 weeks waiting for their spay-neuter. They weren't allowed to leave with a voucher or with a deposit, but they didn't have enough medical capacity to get them all spayed and neutered quickly enough for them to leave. So again, with euthanasia, it's an empty cage at the end of 3 days. We need to be all thinking like that for live outcomes too. At the end of 3 days, those animals need to be leaving. So the spay neuter, whatever's wrong with them, needs to get fixed in a timely manner so that they can go away. Specialty programs, that's the niche programs that Austin Pets Alive does. We have lots of classes on those. The medical make-ready, we don't have a class on, but I'm happy to talk to anybody about that offline. Large dog adequate capacity. So this is kind of a new concept. One thing that I've noticed is that almost all municipal shelters are built to be the same size, no matter what your community looks like, and that doesn't make any sense. If you have a huge free-roaming dog population, why do you have the same number of kennels as a city that doesn't have a huge free-roaming dog population? And so I think it was just a blueprint that got shared with everybody and got built with not a lot of thought put into it. So we have a calculator that we're kind of piloting, I guess I should say, but I think it's important to know that if you want to save all the big dogs, there has to be a place for them to go, whether you're building a huge foster capacity or building more kennels for them. They take longer to get adopted, and a long length of stay is not a reason to die. It just means that we need to make sure they have a place to stay and keep working on getting them out. And then the euthanasia list scrutiny, this is an overlooked area, and the shelter director and the nonprofit in Austin did that for the city, but now the city does that. And so the euthanasia list every day is given to the city director, and then she makes choices. It's almost like the vets are operating as with the shelter director being the client and saying, here's the options for these animals. What do you want to do? And the director says, okay, we're going to spend this money and save this animal, or we're going to push this one really hard to foster, or we're going to euthanize. But that last step allows the director to control the live release rate. And that's what their job is judged on, is the live release rate. And so having that final say is really critically important because not everybody has that responsibility, but the director does. And again, if you save one off that list, that's a percentage increase that wouldn't be there if that person didn't have that final scrutiny. Okay, so this is my stab at a big dog capacity calculator. I believe that we need 1 kennel per 25 dogs. Some shelters double, some triple, maybe even more. And this is assuming that you have a length of stay of at least 14, not at least, an average length of stay of 14 days. So some animals are moving very quickly. Your puppies may not even enter a kennel before they go to foster. This is for all dogs that are entering your shelters. So in the city of Austin, we have 10,000 dogs coming in, puppies, small breeds, big dogs, and we have about 400 kennels between the city and Austin Pets Alive, and that's enough to keep everybody alive. And so that's why we're really kind of pounding this, is that if you don't have that capacity, then you need to find that capacity, because otherwise the big dogs don't have a chance. And they're, in our experience, they really were the hardest group to save just because of this one problem. And it wasn't until Austin Pets Alive moved into the city's old shelter and got all those kennels that it just flipped. And all of a sudden, everybody was saved, or everybody had a chance. And it assumes you have a robust foster program and transfer. So that generally you don't want 400 kennels all on one property, but if you have a good partner that can share that burden, that's a really good thing too. So talking about trying to get more kennels, obviously capital costs are really hard to get in most communities. Animals are not prioritized in the budgeting, but there are some other ways. Increasing foster, I know we're going to have a big dog foster talk later, really important, really easy, cheap way to get more big dogs out alive. Like in our situations, I'm shocked at how many cities have an old shelter sitting around. So look into it. You never know if there's one laying around that can be used by a nonprofit to save more lives. And then partnering with another nonprofit or another community to help share the burden. And grants. Capital's the easiest thing to get through grant writing. So that's one place to spend time is on grant writing, even if you're a municipal shelter. So this is a rough calculator of cost. And I think that it depends on what you've already got. So if you already have a robust system in place, like most municipal shelters do, you have a kind of a system for processing a large number of animals, then your cost to increase the lives saved is not going to be huge. But if you're starting from scratch, then it does cost a lot. It's you can offset some of those costs by having in-kind, like in Austin Pets Alive, we get all of our food donated. That's hundreds of thousands of dollars a year that we save. So there are, and again, in the fundraising presentations, they'll go into detail on that. It's a really important thing to really estimate what you need so that you don't get in over your head by having too many animals and not enough resources. Yeah, so I think I covered most of that. And we can help with that too. So building out your plan. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of meat that you can put into a plan moving forward and use these 3 days to really build that plan out. So the first is figuring out what you don't have. Of those 12 things, what do you not have, and trying to hone in on them, and then figuring out the priority of them. You can't do, if you're small enough, you can probably do them all at once, but if you're in a very large city with a large shelter, you need to prioritize and figure out the resources you need and proactively work towards the goal for each one systematically. And making sure that you're getting those KPIs. The roadmap, the piece of the roadmap is really important because if you don't measure where you want to be and then work backwards and figure out the percentage increases that you're going to do to get to that end result, then you run the risk of it just being a failed program. So charting the roadmap and having and sharing your success. Every time you do something better 1 month from the last, it should be shared with everybody so that people are excited and they want to be part. Everybody wants to be part of success. Let them. Tell them what you're doing right and how it's working. So we, it doesn't, if you have a shelter that has 50% of the animals are living and 50% are not, it doesn't really matter where you start. But it is important to just pick some. Just pick something and go for it. And I would suggest picking 4 and prioritizing those things and try to, just like what Brent was talking about, knock those out. And then in the next year, do another 4 and then another 4, maybe 6 months. I don't know how fast you can move, but just getting some success under your belt will help empower you to get another success under your belt and another one and another one. It's stair step. It doesn't all just happen at once because you want it to happen. And if you're at 80%, focusing on these are probably the things that are lacking. And these are the ones that I would really hone in on because they will help you to get that last 20% out the door.
This is tough stuff. And I know that it can be overwhelming. And I had a conversation with somebody last night of like, the data's not really my thing. And I'm like, but it has to be. Because if you want to save more lives and you want to do it as efficiently as possible, and use the resources, the limited resources you have, then using the data is not an option for you. You have to do it because otherwise you're just chasing something, but you don't even know what you're chasing toward a goal that you may or may not ever hit because you don't know what's dying. So understand your shelter's data. Understand what's going on in your community. It was changed everything for us in Kansas City. We also had somebody who came in and helped us in Kansas City. I'm not ashamed to admit that we called some people and like, help us walk through it. And like, if you need help, call somebody who can help, because there are more than a few people that are able to do that. So understand it, understand what animals are at risk. That'll help you target your efforts to have the maximum impact in your community. Know the key organizations in your area. Know who's doing what. One of the things that happened in Kansas City is we had a low-cost spay and neuter group that was already doing amazing work. Like, there's no reason for us to recreate that. And then people would come to us and like, we really want to donate money to you to set up a spay and neuter clinic. I'm like, give it to them. They're doing great work. We don't need it for that. It's just recreating and duplicating an effort that doesn't need to be duplicated. So again, if you know what everybody else is doing, then you can help fill the gaps that somebody else isn't doing in your community. And then develop the programs to save the lives. And that's the hard part. Once you've identified it, is the building out those programs, but it can be done. Focus on what you can do, and one thing first. I think it was overwhelming for us to try to recreate everything all at once. And I was like, we come to conferences like this, and it's like, wow, everybody's doing so many amazing things. I don't even know where to start. Well, you start by the ones that are going to make the biggest impact in your community, and then build from there. And knowing the data will help you do that. So everyone, you got 3 days to spend like learning what's going to help that you can take back to your community and drive success in your community. Use them wisely, have fun, and let's save a lot of lives together.